Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning. Welcome to the open door. To the Holy Spirit, we hope to welcome the Holy Spirit. We hope to welcome our listeners. We're going to begin this morning with a very short prayer, and then I have some guests to introduce. Direct, we beseech Thee, O Lord, all our actions by Thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by Thy gracious assistance, that every prayer and work of ours may begin always from Thee, and by Thee be happily ended through Christ our Lord. Jim Hannick here, welcoming you again, and our visitors today. Well, we have a special visitor, Zebulon, as in Zeb Buccelli, if I have that correct?
That's right.
And he's coming to us from Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And do we have Ed Rushman there?
And we do.
Well, Ed Rushman is coming to us from Orange County. And do we have John Breen there? Well, John's a student. He's a wonderful student. But you know how students are. They sometimes come a little bit late. We won't hold that against him. Our focus today is on nature and on the environment. And we've been reading ourselves, doing our homework, a selection from various teaching documents of the Church that has been put together by the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. We've also been reading a fascinating convocation presentation by Gabriel Meyer, a journalist of real distinction, a poet, and a pianist, a wonderful combination of talents. And in my notes to my fellow panelists, I wrote the following. Let's discuss the main points of Catholic teaching on nature and the environment. And I'm attaching 2 PDF documents, and I just mentioned those documents. And then I say, to get myself off the hook as early as possible, quote, both documents are fairly long. I invite you to focus our discussion by calling attention to a couple of points from either document that you find of special interest. Now, I happen to know for a true fact that Zeb has a passion for questions involving nature and the environment, that they have a place close to his heart. And so I'm going to ask him to get us started this morning.
Yes, thank you, Jim. And it's true, nature and the environment and ecology are very important to me. My business is selling produce for organic farmers in western Pennsylvania, and the farmers I happen to work with are Amish farmers. So for the type of farming that they do, being in partnership with nature and preserving and rebuilding it is essential for their success and for them to provide for their families. So the story that Mr. Meyer told in his convocation essay, or I guess it's a transcript of a speech, about him visiting
the Dominican fellows at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, California. You may have heard of the place. It's an oasis of sanity. At any rate, they have a group of fellows, and every year they induct 2 or 3 new fellows, and Gabriel was among those inducted this year, and this was the convocation address that he gave.
I see. And in this, he tells a story from his work as a journalist in Sudan, where the Nuba tribe lived in a fairly, it seems, desert-like environment, fairly harsh environment. But there were, in places throughout it, stands of old ancient trees that they relied on for their, for protection from the heat of the environment, from the sun. It gave them shade as well as food. And it was a sacred place to them where they would bury their elders and heroes of their tribe. And the UN at one point, because of the years of civil war in Sudan, sent some protective forces out there, and those forces, not having consulted with the elders of the tribe, bulldozed down one of these old groves of ancient sacred trees to build their base on, but soon found that the environment was so inhospitable that they couldn't survive there. But that was after trying to make it even more hospitable to them in their modern technology and way of thinking by flying in generators and air conditioners and fossil fuels to try to make it work. And finally they gave up and left.
Air conditioners?
Yes.
Does the Holy Father have something to say about air conditioners? Go ahead. That's an untimely interruption.
And so this really, I thought, was a great story and a perfect little parable almost about the people who lived in the place for so long and had found a way to live cooperatively with nature as they found it, and lived lightly on the land and drew their sustenance from it. They couldn't fly in the things they needed to tame the land, so they found ways to use what was there and to respect it and preserve it. And in the face of that, the modern man with the modern mindset came in and thought they could just plow it down and transplant in modern life and modern technology, and found it inhospitable despite all the advantages they had of power and money and technology. And the thing is, this is kind of a microcosm of the situation for all of mankind. We are able to use our technology and our power to tame nature up to a point, but we find more and more, wherever we are, everywhere in the globe, that nature cannot be completely subverted. And as the teachings that you sent us from the bishops say, we depend on nature for our sustenance. It's from nature, from the earth that we come, and God gave it to all of us to be our sustenance. And so having this kind of domineering attitude about it, in the end, is going to be destructive not only to the beauty of God's creation, but to ourselves. And we're finding that to be the case now through everything from pollution to climate change.
That was a moving story that Gabriel Meyer told us. Glad you called our attention to it. We've often commented on this panel, sometimes called the Pelican Panel, invoking the symbol of the American Solidarity Party. We've sometimes commented on bluntly, the incredible, disconcerting mishmash of contemporary life, and so much of that has to do with ecological disasters. Now, I just want to be forward, just in case we leave the Nuba. I'm not sure where Ed is going to take us. Within the last week in South Sudan, where the Nuba people are the majority, there was a series of demonstrations. Where were the demonstrations? Outside of official headquarters of peacekeeping forces. What were the demonstrations directed at? The United States embargo on selling arms in Sudan, including South Sudan. And the activists there in South Sudan opposed the United States embargo of arms on the grounds that they could not maintain their independence without these weapons. So we have ancient people, an ancient culture, and it's not a culture that leads to all sorts of artifacts, but it's a culture that maintained a harmony with the land around it. And now we have the activists within that culture arguing that they should be sent more weapons. I have this dumb line that I've used on many occasions, and this would be one. Original sin is an equal opportunity tempter.
Yeah. Yeah, and it shows how difficult it is, impossible to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. I mean, the people there, I presume, would not have been demanding weapons if it weren't for the weapons of their enemies or the threat that they'd been facing from technologically advanced people interfering in their way of life.
There is something, you mentioned the collection of statements that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has put out. One of them leaps to my eye. I'm looking at it right now because I thought it was one of the most telling. It's from World Day of Peace letter, January 1st, 1990. So that takes us back 28 years. It's short. When man turns his back on the Creator's plan, he provokes a disorder which has inevitable repercussions on the rest of the created order. If man is not at peace with God, then earth itself cannot be at peace. And a line from Hosea, Old Testament, quote, "Therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field and the birds of the air, and even the fish of the sea are taken away." So the interconnection of all things. Well, Ed, suppose we move from South Sudan and the hills of the Nuba people to Congressional District 44. What's going on with the natural order there?
Well, it's 46. I know that you don't have
all right.
technology in front of you right now.
I could have said Area 51. Go ahead.
And many people suspect I'm from Area 51. That's true. But I'm not quite prepared to leave the Nuba people. I think that.
All right.
I think we're a little too. As a society, we're a little too ready to leave them, and that's not a good thing. I should say that I'm in the midst of some crises I have to manage at work, so I may not be on the whole time. I therefore have possibly little time, literally or metaphorically. So I'm going to. By the way, that story practically made me weep. I think I kind of knew that the trees were going to go, but it is so incomprehensible to me that people would destroy someone else's life in the process of saving them, and yet that is the pattern of mankind because we refuse the solution that God gives us, sure that we can make a better one ourselves. And so to jump to solution, and I think there's value in sometimes jumping to solution early because in doing that, I'm hoping I plant a seed that will then get returned to as we look at the rest of these documents and everything.
Yeah.
But to me, the two parts to it are, one is poverty, not abject poverty, not the poverty that is crushing and imposed on one from outside, but holy poverty. And the second thing is humility, because I find both of those really, really applicable to this. In humility, those peacekeeping forces would have hesitated. They would have recognized the sacredness of the trees, not the sacredness as expressed necessarily by the Nuba people, but the fundamental sacredness by the fact that they're created by God and that we should never kill anything without an appropriate level of circumspection. It's funny. There was a bee. We went out to dinner the other night, just at a fast food place, and there was a bee on the floor. And my wife said, "Oh, there's a bee on the floor." And I said, "Okay, indeed, there is in fact a bee on the floor." And and she's looking at me like, "You should be doing something about this." And there's other people in the place, and they look at the bee, and everybody's looking at the bee. And the bee is probably dying if it's on the floor. So I take my little container thing, and I pick it up because I'm not St. Francis. I'm not going to pick it up with my hands. I pick it up, with a little container, and then I go to take it outside. And outside is all pavement. And I couldn't bear to put the bee on the pavement to die. Don't ask me why. I have a strange life. So I take it out to the bushes and put it out into nature. That's the only nature in the city that I could find. Because it deserves, and I actually said this to the people that were next to us, it deserves to die in nature, not on man's pavement. It's just one of those things. It's recognizing the sacredness in a dying bee. Anyway, I'm sorry, to go back to it, though. The idea of poverty, though, I was looking at one of the quotes where it said that to really solve these problems of the environment and everything, we have to change our lifestyle. We have to get away from instant gratification and consumerism. Consumerism, to me, is redundant there. That is all about instant gratification. And in holy poverty, we don't overdo it. So much of our problems in the environment is because we just have to have. We can't live in holy poverty. It is a lifestyle change. It's a change of heart. And in everything that we talk about, man will always try to get what he wants without changing his heart. That is so much a part of the human experience going all the way back to the fall, that we refuse to be what we were called to be, and then we try to make fixes to constantly be fixing it. And funny is that my little conflict, my little crisis at work right now is partly because I work in technology and people have attempted to make fixes rather than solving the root problem. They've made fixes and then had to make fixes because of the fixes and fixes for fixes for fixes, and it just goes on, ad hilarium.
We can't
anyway,
new wine in old wineskins.
And sometimes you just got to go back, and that's kind of my hallmark for the work I do, is that I go to root causes and say, let's chase it all down. We find out what the root problem is. Now let's solve that root problem, and then we don't keep putting Band-Aids on it and keep propping it all up. So along with the environment, when we try to do things, we just end up making it worse if we don't have a fundamental change of heart. And I propose that when we're dealing with the environment, as well as dealing with the gifts of the other humans around us, that holy poverty, and with the humility that has to go with that, those are fundamental keys. And if those do not increase in humanity, then we will ultimately damage and possibly extinguish ourselves.
That's
a lot
more challenging than a lot of us seem to be up to. You're going to, back in District 46, tell people, holy humility, people, holy humility. And you're going to tell them that bee story, and they're going to say, dude, you got one in your bonnet. How are you going to convey this, Ed?
I would hope by the way that I deal with people, by my example. It's not, I am definitely not, I'm anything but, the nicest guy in the world. And I've done some stuff in my life that I'm not very happy about. I've made a lot of mistakes. But through that, it's freed me in some ways to deal with people differently. And the only thing that any of us can do, I think the best thing that any of us can do, is not to pass a law, but to live a life that respects people, that demonstrates the things that we value. And in fact, Everybody already does that. We all live the life that demonstrates the things we value. I'm just hoping that the things I value most are holy poverty and humility. And my campaign, if anybody reads my campaign stuff, I really think that some of this, I hope, comes out as a demonstration. But my point is not to put on a show. My point is just to do things the way that I think they ought to be done. And I really, I mean, that's the main thing. But those two things, anybody can grasp them. And I think all we can do is talk about it and live it and hope that somebody notices. But it's about, it's about free will. People have to choose it.
It seems to me, at least in part what you're saying, connects very, very well with the Greek Orthodox theologian that Gabriel Meyer cites. He has the following quote. It's short enough. Here's somebody who is an Eastern Orthodox theologian. His name is Chrysovagus, and he is very close to the Patriarch Bartholomew. And he writes this, and it was a speech given at my erstwhile employer place, Loyola Marymount. And he says this: far too often we are sure that we have the solutions to the environmental crisis that we face without being still. To listen to the earth that we have so burdened and wounded, let us not forget, however, that it is our very actions which have led us in the first place to the situation we are facing. Before we can begin to act responsibly, we are called to stand still. The message of asceticism is, don't just do something, stand there. Is that part of what you want to say?
I think that our modern abhorrence of silence is a huge problem. And I think that the idea of being reflective of recollection, which is not something I don't think that gets talked about much, but I remember hearing it in a recorded talk by Thomas Merton once, and it's remembering what we're about. I think one of the best things that's helped me is the fact that I've had quiet. My upbringing forced me to be comfortable with doing nothing, to be comfortable waiting and quiet and having no amusements, and that helps. I think being more reflective, having silence, having that mindset is probably a good thing. It allows us to hear things. I'll share something that's been a frustration for me with you. I work occasionally in some stuff that's volunteer-wise and working with young people and stuff. And one of the things I've noticed, it's not the young people, but the older people that work with the young have an abhorrence of silence. I have actually known them to give a talk with music playing over it and then tell people, oh, now go discuss among yourselves, and then they play music over that. And it's not, it's not Gregorian chant, baby, let me tell you. It's going to be, it's loud, it's rap, it's stuff like that. And it's like, well, this is what the young people want. No, the young people want silence. The young people want reality. They want sincerity. They want genuine things. And I think that they value the idea of a quiet conversation without all the noise and without all the flashing lights and everything else. We try to compete with the world. We cannot outworld the world. We will never overcome the world by being more like it. It's contrasts that people notice, not more of the same. And it's a big part of humanity, and modern times maybe the most, that we think by increasing the volume that we will get the message across. Instead of giving a better message, we just increase the volume. But you and I have talked a long time. I want to let you get back to Zeb.
Yeah, let me try it this way with Zeb. Zeb, do the Amish people that you work with, would they understand what Ed is saying, or would they approach things differently?
The ones who I work with, I think, definitely would understand it. I mean, for one thing, silence is a big value to them. They prohibit the use or playing of music, and so the only kind of music they have when they work or other times is their own singing. But their approach to technology is one that I think fits with the sort of ascetic attitude that Gabriel Meyer was talking about in his paper, where they don't have a blanket condemnation of technology or even of any particular form of it, like electricity or anything else. But they have a resistance to adopting new technology because they feel like it will change the way they relate to each other, to God, and to the world in ways that are not predictable. And so they'll only take on a new technological option after a lot of discernment and deciding that it's truly necessary. If it's not necessary but just seems like it would be nice and harmless, they'll still forbid it because they know from experience that something that seems nice and harmless can end up having a lot of unintended consequences. And they've also seen, especially in Western Pennsylvania, how openness to any kind of exploitation that might seem to be beneficial, like clear-cutting the forest or strip mining the land, leaves the land unable to support human life and family life afterwards. A lot of the land out here has been strip mined back in the middle of the 20th century, and even now, 50 years later, it's very difficult to grow any kind of crop on it because the soil is so disturbed and ruined. So it's hard for them to find farms to buy and fertile land for, as the new generation comes up and there's kids who need to find their own place, it becomes difficult for them to find places to go out here. So they're very attuned to that concern and the need to be conservative in the sense of consumption and application of technology and ambition, because they see how sort of wild abandon and just letting everyone do what they want and pursue their desires leads to the destruction of culture and land and sustainability in a social sense, in a community sense.
It seems that one aspect of their ability to discern is a very, very strong sense of place. Turns out that the Benedictines, Roman Catholic monastic order, going all the way back to the 400s, they take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they take a fourth vow. It's the vow of stability. In becoming a Benedictine, one is attached to a particular monastery at a particular place. And the idea is this is where one will live one's life. And this abbey, if it's an older abbey, hasn't moved about. It's been where it is, and the community has been attached to it. And if a newer abbey is started, as is still the case in some instances, there's a place in Oklahoma that started that's relatively new, but the whole idea is we are here to stay, whereas in our society today, the idea is follow the job. Follow the job. In my own case, I grew up in the very Athens of the Midwest, Grand Rapids, Michigan. And in order to have a job teaching philosophy, I found myself in Los Angeles. And when I came here, it was on a one-year contract. Now, as Providence operated, that was many, 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 many years ago, like 45 years ago. But I was in a position where I fully anticipated having to move often. And I think that the fact that the Amish stay where they are until they need to, I guess in evangelical language it would be, till they need to plant a new church, I think that's extraordinarily important.
Yes, it really impresses on them the importance of maintaining the value of the place and making it more valuable. Even they do, individual families or people may move around surprisingly more than I would have expected before I got to know them. But the land, the property never leaves the community. And so if an Amish person decides they want to move their family to some other place where they have extended family, they're going to be selling their farm to some other Amish family who's moving into that community. And they know that that farm they want it to sell for enough money that they can get started in their new place. So they need to make sure that they've treated the land well and that it's going to be worth something to the new family moving in.
Yes.
So yes, having that connection really makes them good stewards of the place where they are. It's not an option to just move somewhere else and forget where they used to be and get a new job. You know, that mobility that we have in this modern society makes it very easy to ignore the consequences of what we might be doing to the place where we are, because we're so free to just abandon it if it gets too unlivable.
Let me read another excerpt from this backgrounder that the bishops have provided, and this comes from Pope Emeritus Benedict in the document Caritas in Veritate, Charity and Truth. And it's, if you have that material handy, it's in the middle of page 4. He says this, and again, I'd like you to reflect on how the Amish people might respond to this. So, Pope Benedict, it is contradictory to insist that future generations respect the natural environment when our educational systems and laws do not help them to respect themselves. The book of nature is one and indivisible. It takes in not only an environment, but also life, sexuality, marriage, the family, social relations. In a word, integral human development. Our duties towards the environment are linked to our duties towards the human person, considered in himself and in relation to others. It would be wrong to uphold one set of duties while trampling on the other. Herein lies a grave contradiction in our mentality and practice today, one which demeans the person, disrupts the environment, and damages society.
Yes, I think as far as the Amish go, I think this is something that they would agree with completely. And certainly they put the importance of community and family much above the importance of environmental stewardship, to be honest. That's their number one concern. And it is out of that concern that their stewardship of the natural world is derived, you know, because they see how, for them as primarily agricultural people, they need a productive and healthy natural world to be centered in order for the higher goods of family and community and church to flourish. I think that's one of the real weaknesses of the modern environmentalist movement, is the tendency to sort of just flip the industrialist view of nature upside down, where the industrialist view sees man as the good and society and civilization as the good, and nature as the thing to be tamed and exploited. So the environmentalist movement often sees man as the bad, and the goal of the movement is to save nature from man, and sees man as separate and other from nature. And one of the quotes from just above that one that you read says that the church has a responsibility towards creation, and she must assert this responsibility in the public sphere. In doing so, she must defend not only earth, water, and air as gifts of creation that belong to everyone. She must, above all, protect mankind from self-destruction. There is need for what might be called a human ecology correctly understood. And that term, human ecology, I think is such an interesting and important one, to realize that we are ourselves a part of nature. We come from nature. We are animals in one way of looking at humanity. And we are constantly in communication with nature, even if you're living in an apartment in New York City. In so many ways that you might not be aware of, the natural world is still interacting with you in ways that are unconscious. And there's a place for man in nature. That's told to us right in the beginning in Genesis, that man is meant to be the steward of the garden, and then after that is to scratch out his living tilling the earth. So we need to understand man's place and respect it. And in order to have a healthy relationship with the natural world, we also at the same time have to respect that human ecology and understand and support the dignity of man and his community, the human community.
I heard you to say that at the very center of Amish thinking, and it's the center that leads them to have the regard for nature that they do, at the very center is the regard for the family, and one works out from there. That's the center. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Now, in these passages that we just mentioned, there was a reference to education. And I think a great many people would argue, wrongly I think, that somehow the Amish are failing their children by not providing them the kind of education that they need if they're to be good citizens of New York City.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that line of criticism?
Well, I think people can only say that if they've never really known Amish people. Because it's true, they only go to school through 8th grade, and then after that, they are supposedly in like a sort of vocational education, but that basically means they just start going to work. But if you get to know Amish people, they are very smart and very inquisitive. They read a lot. They're better at like mental arithmetic than I ever was. And
are you counting on your fingers?
Well, I just use my phone now. I've got a calculator on my phone. But they've got to be able to do it in their head still.
Uh-huh.
And Amish people who leave the community and try to go to enter into what they call the English, into the mainstream culture, are often very successful and able to go into higher education if they choose to, in spite of the limited education, like school-wise education that they've gotten. But the education that they do get, if they stay in the community, is sufficient for them to succeed in the kinds of enterprises that they are involved in. And I think more importantly, the way that they are brought up in community and in family, including their education, helps them to thrive and feel connected to the community that they're in. And the resources that they have in place of that kind of like formal education that we have are a vast network of intelligent and successful people that they can rely on to help them make decisions and sort of make their way in the world. So their education certainly doesn't hold them back from doing what they may want to do. The only thing that holds them back is if they stay committed to their faith, which limits their opportunities. But like I said, those who decide that they don't want to live in that community anymore find it relatively easy to succeed in our world because they've been taught just how to think, how to be self-disciplined. They have the skills necessary to get educated more than just having like the factual knowledge put into their heads.
Uh-huh. Yes. I'm thinking this might be a move from the Amish to the Mennonites. I'm not sure, but in terms of the academic theology world, the name John Howard Yoder comes to mind immediately. Taught at Notre Dame, among other places, a distinguished American theologian who certainly had Anabaptist, to use a more generic term, Anabaptist roots and inspirations.
Yes, yeah.
Well, in your own work with the Amish, we haven't totally forgotten the Nuba, and I'm sure there are 1,000,005 distinctions between the two. What are some of the things that maybe you've learned and some of the things that have surprised you?
The biggest thing that surprised me was, and I referenced this before, that their approach to technology is not one of blanket condemnation or of simple religious taboo. It's really a practical approach, and it's what we saw completely missing from the interaction between the UN and the Nuba in that story. But it is a pragmatic sort of skepticism about the potential effects of introducing new technologies. And, I'd always just assumed that they thought that electricity and cars were evil and that that the mainstream Americans were doing something against God's will by having them. And that's not their attitude at all. It's just that they see how those things affect our lives, and they don't want their lives to be affected in a similar way. And I think the general attitude is something that I've tried to take on board, of being more skeptical and questioning, why do I need to have this or that technology in the home? Everyone having an internet device, for example, is something that we've chosen not to have in our house.
I chose to have one, but it's not working today. You mentioned the word taboo. It's not a taboo.
No.
One of the thinkers, seems to me, that has a whole lot to say to the American Solidarity Party, with which we both have ties, is Alistair McIntyre. And in his great work After Virtue, McIntyre uses the word taboo in its technical sense. Having a practice which is kept in practice, but no one any longer knows why. And when it is challenged in just the right way, it collapses almost immediately. Now, it would seem that the Amish position on technology is the exact opposite of a taboo.
Yeah.
It's a position that's been carefully worked out, argued for, returned to again and again, and it's a matter of active discernment, as far from being a taboo as anything could be.
Yeah, that's right. A funny example from my own interaction with this particular group here, and every Amish community is different, then they're free to make different decisions about each technological opportunity. But one with this community here is that I take the orders for the farmers of what the customers want them to harvest 4 days a week. And there's about 18 farms, and so with them not having a phone or email, it's a challenge to get those orders to them. And I proposed setting up a voicemail system where I could leave a voice message for each of them saying what their order was the next day, so that I didn't have them going to their neighbor's phone to call me and having 18 people calling me randomly throughout the evening. And they decided that they were not going to do that, not because of any particular technology involved there, because they do use their neighbors' phones, and they'll use automated voice systems to check the weather or something like that. But they rejected it because they thought that if they have that opportunity at their disposal, they'll be able to leave messages for each other as well, not just get my messages. And they know that if they can do that, they will do it, because it's much easier to do that than drive down to the neighbor's house and talk to him face to face. So they foresaw that having this voicemail system was going to take away their face-to-face communication. So they refused to do it, even though it would have made our business work a lot easier. And it's that kind of pragmatic thinking that I really respect in them, even though that made my job a little harder that day. It's the approach and the value hierarchy that they make these decisions with that I think is really worth paying attention to.
I have a couple of anecdotes that connect with that. When I was teaching, as in teaching students, I still think of myself as teaching in other ways, and in an academic department, the particular department I was in had maybe, let's say, depends on the day, but maybe 18, 20 people. And most of the communication among those 18 or 20 people during the day, all in the same space, was by email. And I would think about that from time to time. It wasn't totally lost on me. And I would make an effort from time to time to walk down the hall, as far as 10, 12 yards. But most of the time, I'm sorry to say, I gave in and I would just email. And I have a son who's a software engineer, and here's a plus. His employer, main office, is in Northern California, but my son is in Southern California, and everything is by email. But he said before he moved, when he was there in the pit, as it were, of software engineers, they could be 3 feet from each other, and they would still communicate electronically. And I mentioned once on this panel the widely syndicated cartoon Dilbert, and I don't think the people that were present that day were familiar with Dilbert, but it's just about as widely syndicated as Dagwood and Blondie were once upon a time. And Dilbert's built around the complete loss of social interaction in a day-to-day way. The people who are featured in Dilbert are about as odd as they could possibly be. And the idea is, quite deliberately, they've been made that way by the technology that they work with. And more in the last year or so, Dilbert cartoons have had to do with upgrading robots so that the robots will manipulate their owners. And it's not a Planet of the Apes round 2, round 3, round 4, but with the development of bots, as they're called, the war between robots and their human manufacturers. So all of this is something that we're aware of on one level, laugh about it to a certain extent, but are changed by it on a day-to-day basis without really appreciating it as much as we should.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's interesting with the American Solidarity Party, and I'm staying with you, Zeb, because I think Ed has been called away. I don't know if you noticed it, but there was a bing a few minutes ago.
Okay.
I'm still here.
Oh, well, you haven't been called away. Then I'm not going to get back to Ed at this point. I'm getting back to you. You're showing yourself to be a contemplative and an ascetic, and yet there you are using what in your campaign? I keep thinking of theory and practice, practice and theory, theory and practice. How was your campaign working? By social media, right?
It's because it's all I have.
All right. So now how does all of this fit with our other themes this morning?
Because we give the primacy to people, we give the primacy to relationship, and we always take the best that we can get. It's almost a kind of mirror reflection of subsidiarity. We want the most direct contact with people that we can have. We want to take it at the lowest, most fundamental level whenever we can, human to human, face to face. And when we can't have that, we take what we can get. And if we can't have the thing that's closest to that, then we take the thing that's farther away. So if I can't reach out and touch every single person, I'm rather forced into social media and hoping that people will spread the message and that they will go face-to-face. And there's some of that, and that's a good thing. In business school, we call it high touch. And it's funny because I'm an agent of change. That's what I do, even though there's no title for that. And when I go out to places, I just had a very interesting encounter yesterday where I don't realize sometimes the effect that I have. And I think the effect is strong because I go face-to-face every chance I get. That's what I want to do. That's the reason why I went out and walked the neighborhoods, even though I can't get to everybody in the district. I absolutely must go door to door. I must have the experience of walking up to somebody's door and not knowing what I'm going to face, and they need to have the experience of somebody coming to their door that they did not ask for, that is coming to give them a message. We need to have that experience with each other and to be good neighbors to each other. And if I don't do that, I'm missing something, and I think that all the social media and everything else will fail if I don't have that contact with people. So sometimes I've actually found some of my best messages on social media, best received have been the ones where I tell about going door to door and what people tell me.
A story.
That's right. And in a sense, by extension, when we tell stories about our encounters with each other, I don't mean gossip, but good stories about the things that happen with each other. And I've had some amusing things happen. In a sense, it's once removed, but it's still human-to-human interaction. I am carrying that experience of somebody I met at one door, I'm carrying that to somebody else's door. And in doing that, it's being a connector that joins together the community. And that's one of the things that we're kind of lacking right now.
Yes. Gentlemen, we've got 8 minutes left. And usually at this point, I really push on news of our American Solidarity Party campaigns. But Ed has done that somewhat already. And so maybe what we could do is, in the last 8 minutes or so, look again to the theological grounding of our right relationship to nature and our right relationship to one another within the church. And I'm going to go to the last page of Gabriel Meyer's convocation address. It has to do with all the things we've been talking to in the context of the Eucharist. And here I think we would find a real difference with our Amish friends, and I think we would find, in most cases, a simple incomprehension on the part of voters today, especially active political workers today. So I'm on the last page of this, in the first complete paragraph, and I'll read, but don't hesitate to stop me at any point. Far from being its abuser, we are to be creation's advocate before God, seeking its good and receiving God's life in return, tending it with a care that reflects God's pleasure, thereby grounding ecological action in celebration, prayer, and discernment, and what the patristic writers call the heart with its eyes open. And then in the last paragraph, Gabriel Meyer continues, it seems to me, if we didn't catch what he was referring to, it seems to me that this Eucharistic perspective is the essential ground upon which we might begin to recover our ecological balance, reshape our lifestyle and ideals, and acquire, interesting juxtaposition here, the sobriety, the boldness, the moral imagination, and humility to face the challenges that are before us. It has the signal advantage of being an ecological model that we needn't and indeed cannot invent. Created by God's Trinitarian love, it already exists. We already experience it in worship, whereby the natural goods of the earth are transformed into vehicles of revelation and unity, an ecological communion into which we are and have always been invited. And then there's the poem, 2 stanzas, William Carlos Williams. There is nothing to eat, seek it where you will, but the body of the Lord. The blessed plants and the sea yield it to the imagination intact. So we are fed in the most fundamental way in the Eucharist. And the Eucharist takes into its miracle, constant miracle, bread and wine. And in this bread and wine, we consume the body and blood of Jesus, soul and divinity. And this is a profound communion that we could not have imagined, but it involves the natural order. And in fact, without the natural order, we would be lost. But because of this, we can also advocate for nature.
Yes, and the bread and wine, of course, come from agriculture, which comes from the natural world. And if we trace that end product, the last thing that we present to God, that he then transubstantiates into the body and blood, it has its roots all the way down into the depths of the created order. And so in that sacrament, the two are really coming together in a way where we act as the steward of creation, and as Gabriel says there, as creation's advocate before God, molding it into the final form in which we present it to him for his sanctification.
And you've called to mind Genesis earlier in the hour, and what do we have with Cain and Abel but a disruption, a profound disruption of agricultural harmony in the context of the link between agriculture and the worship of God.
Yeah.
A kind of blasphemy at the beginning, and that blasphemy, I think, is something that we can always fall back into. It strikes me that so many people that are exposed to Scripture, especially the Old Testament, think of it as hopelessly archaic. What is it with this idol worship? I haven't seen an idol lately. Oh, you haven't? Well, here's one, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one. What is it with this idea of we ought to turn to God in worship and sacrifice the first fruits of what we do. What is it? Well, we sacrifice to one idol after another idol after another idol, and one of the perverse sacrifices we make is the sacrifice of the integrity of the natural order, doing everything we can to replace it with our poor substitutes, and all of this is right there in Scripture, always.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's draw to a close. I want to thank Zeb, and I want to thank Ed, and thank you, our auditors. And we'll be back next week, and now we close with a short prayer. The people who have lived in darkness have seen a great light. Maranatha, come, Lord Jesus, come. Good morning to you all.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.